There is a piece of Russian territory sitting inside NATO's borders right now, surrounded, isolated, and slowly running out of everything it needs to survive. Not by accident, not as a side effect of some distant conflict, by design, by strategy, by the deliberate, coordinated, and patient decisions of governments that decided they had been tolerant long enough. I'm Dr. Margaret Sullivan, and what is happening to Kaliningrad right now is one of the most consequential strategic operations unfolding in Europe, and most of the world is barely paying attention to it. Let me explain why that is a serious mistake. Kaliningrad is not a city most people think about. It sits on the Baltic coast, wedged between Poland to the south and Lithuania to the north and east. It is geographically detached from the Russian mainland. No land bridge connects it to Russia proper. Every road, every railway, every power cable, every drop of fuel that feeds that region has to travel through foreign territory, through NATO territory, to reach Russian hands. For decades, this was an arrangement Russia tolerated because it had no choice, and for decades the West tolerated it too, because it was easier, because it was stable, and because the alternative was confrontation. That calculus changed on February 24, 2022. The day Russia invaded Ukraine was not only a military decision, it was, although few recognized it immediately, a geopolitical turning point for Kaliningrad. Because the invasion erased the political reluctance that had kept NATO's eastern members from acting on what they had known for years, that Kaliningrad was simultaneously Russia's greatest offensive asset in Europe and Russia's most structurally exposed vulnerability. What followed was not a sudden explosion. It was something more dangerous. It was a systematic, deliberate, and carefully calibrated campaign to make Kaliningrad's lifelines unsustainable. One border crossing, one transit route, one power cable, one petroleum contract at a time. And right now, in the spring of 2026, that campaign has reached a point where the numbers are no longer theoretical. They are devastating. To understand what is happening, you need to understand what Kaliningrad actually is, not as a city, but as a strategic object. Kaliningrad has roughly 1 million people living inside it. It has a major Russian naval base, the Baltic Fleet headquarters. It hosts Iskander-M ballistic missile systems, nuclear capable, with a range that puts Warsaw, Berlin, Copenhagen, and Stockholm within striking distance. It sits at the heart of what military planners call the Suwalki Gap, the narrow land corridor between Poland and Lithuania that connects NATO's Baltic states to the rest of the alliance. Whoever controls the pressure around Kaliningrad controls the strategic tension in that gap. For Russia, Kaliningrad is a bargaining chip, a forward military base, a psychological weapon, and a symbol of World War II victory, all compressed into one exclave on the Baltic Sea. But here is the structural contradiction that has always made Kaliningrad so dangerous for Moscow. Maintaining it requires a constant flow of resources through countries that are now members of a military alliance formally opposed to Russian aggression. Fuel, food, electricity, cement, steel, all of it had to come through Poland or Lithuania. Russia's most militarily sensitive outpost in Europe was, by geography, entirely dependent on the goodwill of its adversaries. Putin used Kaliningrad for years as a platform for threats. What he may not have fully calculated was that those same adversaries were watching, waiting, and building the legal and logistical case to turn that dependency into a vice. Poland moved first. And Poland moved with a precision that deserves serious analytical attention. Since 2022, Warsaw has been escalating its posture toward Kaliningrad in incremental steps. Customs controls tightened, visa conditions narrowed, border crossings slowed, each step individually defensible under existing agreements, each step collectively building toward something much larger. Then, in December 2025, Poland crossed into a different category of pressure entirely. On December 23rd, Warsaw shut down the last Russian consulate operating in Gdansk. This was not a routine diplomatic readjustment. That building had been functioning for years as an intelligence collection center, monitoring NATO naval traffic in the Baltic Sea, tracking port activity, intercepting radio communications. Its rooftop equipment tracked NATO vessel movements. It gave the Kaliningrad garrison strategic situational awareness of everything happening along Poland's Baltic coastline. The consulate in Poznan had already been closed. That facility had monitored NATO exercises, armor movements, ammunition logistics in western Poland. The consulate in Krakow was also gone. Russia now has no official diplomatic presence in Poland outside the Warsaw Embassy. The Kaliningrad garrison has lost its intelligence eyes in western Poland. A military command operating without ground-level intelligence on its immediate strategic environment is flying partially blind. And that matters enormously when what surrounds it is an increasingly fortified NATO military infrastructure. Because while Poland was closing those intelligence windows, it was simultaneously building what may become the most significant military construction project on European soil since the Cold War, the Eastern Shield, announced in May 2024, described by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk as the largest fortification operation on Poland's eastern border since 1945. The numbers involved are not symbolic. A budget of $2.5 billion, 700 kilometers of border, 3-layered defensive lines, anti-tank trenches 4 meters deep, 6 rows of concrete dragon's teeth barriers, camouflaged bunker networks, minefields, surveillance systems, all designed to make the terrain between Kaliningrad and the NATO interior physically impassable for armored formations. Construction accelerated sharply in January 2026. In April of the same year, German engineering units deployed to Poland on a 2-year mission specifically to support Eastern Shield construction. Germany, the country that has spent 8 decades defining its foreign policy around the principle of strategic restraint. The country whose constitution was written to prevent it from ever again becoming a military aggressor on European soil. That Germany is now deploying approximately 5,000 troops and more than 100 Leopard 2 tanks to Lithuania, permanently. The first time the German military has permanently stationed forces abroad since the end of World War II. Read that again, because it tells you how seriously Berlin now assesses the threat environment in the Baltic region. NATO's military presence is expanding both south and north of Kaliningrad. The Suwalki Gap, the strategic corridor Kaliningrad was always meant to threaten, is being hardened. The alliance that Kaliningrad's missiles were designed to intimidate is now physically closing the space around it. The southern gate is being sealed with concrete and steel. Now look north, look at what Lithuania has been doing, and understand that what Lithuania has done may ultimately be more consequential than any military maneuver. Lithuania controls the railway that runs through its territory from mainland Russia to Kaliningrad. For decades, this single rail line was Kaliningrad's lifeline. Fuel, construction materials, industrial goods, agricultural products, food, coal. Everything that could not be delivered efficiently by sea came through Lithuania by rail. When this line is fully operational, Kaliningrad breathes. When it is constrained, the region begins to suffocate. Lithuania began testing its leverage on this line in June 2022, just months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Citing European Union sanctions, Vilnius restricted the transit of strategic goods, steel, cement, construction materials, through its territory to Kaliningrad. The response from Moscow was immediate and furious. Kaliningrad's governor warned that the region would lose 40 to 50% of its transit goods. Kremlin officials threatened serious consequences. Lithuania did not flinch, and that moment, that very specific moment when a small NATO member state restricted a key Russian supply line and Russia could do nothing meaningful in response. That moment lit a green light that has not turned off since. Because what Lithuania demonstrated in June 2022 was that Kaliningrad's transit dependency was not a protected geopolitical arrangement. It was a vulnerability, and a NATO member state could exploit it with nothing more than a legal citation. The Kremlin's threats evaporated because threats only carry weight when they can be backed by force. Russia was already committing its military resources to Ukraine. It could not simultaneously open pressure on Lithuania. Putin had been bluffed, and everyone saw it. What followed was a steady expansion of the goods list blocked at the Lithuanian border. Construction materials, electronics, luxury goods. Category by category, the transit restrictions tightened. Local businesses in Kaliningrad began to feel the compression. Concrete suppliers reported they could not move a single cubic meter of their product because cement trains were being turned back at the Lithuanian border. Construction projects stalled. Partially finished buildings sat idle. But the decisive blow came not from a calculated policy decision. It came from balloons. In November 2025, smuggling balloons carrying contraband cigarettes crossed from Belarus into Lithuanian airspace and paralyzed Vilnius airport. 25 flights disrupted, more than 3,000 passengers stranded. Lithuania formally assessed this as a deliberate hybrid attack orchestrated by the Belarusian regime. A state that functions, in every meaningful sense, as a geopolitical extension of Moscow. Vilnius closed its border crossings with Belarus. The domino effect was immediate and severe. Thousands of Lithuanian registered trucks operating in Belarusian territory were suddenly stranded. The Lithuanian Transport Association reported between 4,500 and 5,000 trucks and trailers effectively held hostage. Minsk threatened to seize the vehicles and began moving them to paid storage facilities. Lithuania responded not with concessions but with escalation. Because the balloon crisis gave Vilnius exactly the legal and political justification it had been waiting for. On October 31st, Lithuanian Railways, LTG, made a critical public announcement. Citing compliance with United States and United Kingdom sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, the railway operator initiated a 21-day transition period for the transit of Russian petroleum products to Kaliningrad. No new applications for petroleum transit would be accepted. On November 21st, the transition period expired. Lukoil's petroleum flow to Kaliningrad stopped completely. The numbers reveal the scale of what this means. In 2024, 371,000 tons of petroleum products moved through this railway line. 345,000 of those tons belonged to Lukoil. In 2025, before the ban took full effect, another 194,000 tons had passed through. After November 21st, zero. This is not an abstract statistic. This is civilian fuel. This is the diesel that runs Kaliningrad's buses, ambulances, and emergency generators. This is the heating fuel that keeps buildings from freezing during Baltic winters. This is also the fuel that powers the Baltic fleet's operational logistics and keeps the Iskander missile launchers mobile. A missile system that cannot be moved is not a threat. It is a fixed target. And if you think that is the limit of Lithuania's intentions, listen to what the ruling party's leadership has said publicly. Ruling coalition leader Minda Simonite explicitly stated that transit restrictions to Kaliningrad can be further expanded, implying the complete halt of all railway freight, including fertilizers and remaining permitted goods. But even beyond that, there is something more radical sitting on the table. Something that, if implemented, would make the Russian railway connection to Kaliningrad physically impossible. Not politically restricted, but physically impossible. The Baltic states are preparing to abandon the Soviet-era wide-gauge rail standard and switch to the European standard gauge. The Rail Baltica project is scheduled to lay modern high-speed rail from Tallinn to Warsaw by 2030. This transition is about integrating the Baltic states fully into the European rail network. But its secondary effect, perhaps not entirely unintentional, is that once the standard changes, Russian train carriages designed for wide-gauge track cannot physically operate on the new infrastructure. There is no legal barrier. The 2002 Russia-EU-Lithuania transit agreement covered only passenger visa arrangements. It provided no legal guarantee protecting rail standards. If and when this happens, the physical infrastructure for Russian rail access to Kaliningrad ceases to exist. Not restricted, not monitored, gone. Now add the energy dimension, because this is where the situation becomes almost mathematically suffocating. For decades, Kaliningrad was connected to an electrical grid shared across the Soviet space, a network linking Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on a single synchronized frequency, called the Brel Ring. It kept the lights on from Minsk to Tallinn. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania made the decision years ago to sever this connection and synchronize instead with the European continental grid, the ENT-SOE network. They have now completed that transition. On February 8, 2025, the Baltic states disconnected from Brel and joined the European grid. Kaliningrad did not. Kaliningrad cannot. It sits outside the European grid, and it is now, in a precise technical sense, an electrical island, disconnected from the large synchronized systems that give power grids their stability and resilience. Russia's response was to deploy a floating LNG terminal, the Marshal Vasilevsky, to generate electricity locally. Moscow said the region would generate its own power. The problem is that independent energy analysts are identifying three structural vulnerabilities in this plan that no piece of equipment can fully resolve. First, frequency instability. Large electrical grids maintain frequency stability because they draw on vast combined capacity. When one generator fails or one load spikes, the grid absorbs it. An island grid, small, isolated, with limited backup capacity, cannot absorb shocks the same way. A single significant malfunction at the wrong moment can cascade into a regional blackout. And in Kaliningrad, a regional blackout is not an inconvenience. It is hospitals losing power. It is water treatment systems shutting down. It is heating systems failing in a Baltic winter. It is a 1 million person population suddenly without the infrastructure that keeps a modern city functioning. Second, cost. Natural gas delivered by LNG tanker ship is vastly more expensive than gas delivered by pipeline. That cost difference translates directly into higher electricity prices for Kaliningrad's businesses and residents, in a regional economy that is already under severe strain from the broader isolation campaign. Third, and this is the one that transforms strategic planning into a weather-dependent gamble, maritime vulnerability. In November 2025, the Baltic Sea froze earlier than expected. Ice conditions in the Gulf of Gdansk significantly restricted tanker access. Icebreakers managed to deliver only 2 LNG shipments during the worst of the freeze, and each tanker provided approximately 12 days of operational fuel supply. 12 days. If the next ship cannot get through, Kaliningrad runs down its reserves. Putin's emergency energy solution for his most strategically sensitive exclave turns out to be contingent on Baltic Sea weather patterns. Step back now and look at the complete picture. Kaliningrad in 2022 had 3 functioning supply lines: road through Poland, railway through Lithuania, energy through the Brel grid. As of spring 2026, here is where each of those stands. The road route through Poland, effectively closed. 6 border crossings have been shut down. The 2 that remain open on paper are processing a maximum of 5 vehicles per hour. Lines of 8 to 12 hours are standard. Insurance companies now classify the Kaliningrad road route as a war zone risk corridor and refuse to cover vehicles operating on it. Without insurance, trucks cannot operate. Without trucks, commercial freight cannot move. 18,000 truck drivers are unemployed. Shipping companies have gone bankrupt. The logistics infrastructure connecting Kaliningrad to Western Europe by road has effectively collapsed. The railway route through Lithuania, petroleum transit halted. 371,000 tons of annual fuel flow cut to zero. Rail removal under active discussion. Physical infrastructure replacement planned by 2030. The energy grid disconnected. Kaliningrad is an electrical island running on a floating LNG terminal whose supply is weather-dependent, cost-prohibitive, and structurally fragile. What remains is the sea route. Ships operating between Russian Baltic ports and Kaliningrad's port of Baltic. Ferry traffic has increased. Ships are running. But the sea route carries its own set of structural problems that make it an inadequate substitute for everything that has been lost. The cost. Every ton of freight shipped by sea costs approximately 4 times what the same freight costs to move by road. That multiplier affects every business, every utility, every construction project, every consumer in Kaliningrad. It is a permanent inflation tax on the entire regional economy. The capacity. Ferries are slow. Port infrastructure in Baltic was not designed to handle the volume that rail and road previously absorbed. Ships are reportedly waiting weeks to unload. The throughput is simply insufficient for a population of 1 million and a major military garrison. And the security dimension. With Finland and Sweden having joined NATO, the Baltic Sea is now almost entirely enclosed by alliance territory. Every Russian vessel making the run from the mainland to Kaliningrad is operating in a body of water, where NATO has surveillance, maritime patrol assets, and naval presence at every strategic choke point. Anyone who followed what Ukraine did to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, sinking or disabling a significant portion of Russia's most powerful naval force using a combination of drone technology, missiles, and tactical creativity, understands what this environment means for Russian shipping. The Black Sea experience demonstrated that modern naval forces operating in constrained, contested waters are profoundly vulnerable to asymmetric attack. Russia's resupply route is expensive, slow, insufficient, and sits inside a NATO lake. Now, what does Moscow do with this? Kaliningrad's military assets still represent real leverage. The Iskander-M systems deployed there are nuclear capable. Their range covers major European capitals. The Baltic Fleet, even constrained, maintains operational capability. Russia's anti-access and area denial systems in the region, radar, air defense, electronic warfare, still represent a significant military footprint that NATO planners cannot ignore. The Kremlin has not been silent about this. In April 2026, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko publicly described NATO's Baltic exercises as rehearsals for a seizure of Kaliningrad and warned of consequences. But here is the critical analytical point. The effectiveness of a threat is not determined by the words used to deliver it. It is determined by the credible capacity to act on it. And Russia's credible capacity to act on threats related to Kaliningrad is being eroded by the same war that triggered all of this. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia was sustaining approximately 35,000 casualties per month on the Ukrainian front. Monthly mobilization was covering only 27,000 replacements. The arithmetic is straightforward and grim. Russia is losing more personnel than it is generating. An army in that situation cannot simultaneously manage a confrontation with NATO on a second front. The threats grow louder, the capacity to back them shrinks, and NATO's commanders are not pretending otherwise. U.S. European Command has publicly stated the ability to neutralize Kaliningrad from land positions in a strategically significant time frame. Behind that statement stands Eastern Shield, Lithuania's new training facility at Suwalki, with 4,000 soldiers and NATO naval dominance across the Baltic. The nuclear card remains, but nuclear blackmail works on a spectrum of credibility that degrades with repeated use and unfulfilled threat. Lithuania tested that credibility in June 2022 and found it hollow. The precedent has been set. Each subsequent Russian warning that goes unacted upon makes the next one less convincing. Inside Kaliningrad, there is one economic metric that appears to be holding: domestic tourism. Russians unable to travel internationally due to sanctions, flight restrictions, and financial constraints have turned to Kaliningrad as a domestic destination. The region's airport processed 4 million passengers in 2023. In 2025, it exceeded 5 million. Hotels are operating at high occupancy. But here is what that statistic conceals. Those domestic tourists spend rubles in a closed regional economy. They do not bring foreign currency. They do not replace industrial supply chains. They do not substitute for fuel, cement, steel, or the 371,000 tons of petroleum that Lithuania no longer allows through. In 2019, Kaliningrad generated approximately $500 million in foreign tourist revenue. In 2025, that figure had dropped to roughly $100 million. The hotels are full, but the economy is on a narrowing base. The military garrison is consuming resources that need replenishment, and the strategic cost of maintaining Kaliningrad is rising every month, while the war in Ukraine continues to drain the national budget and the national manpower pool. Lithuania's intelligence services have reported that Russia is forming new naval infantry units inside Kaliningrad. Moscow is reinforcing the garrison even as the logistical foundation beneath it weakens. This is the decision-making dynamic of a government that cannot politically afford to reduce its commitment to a symbol of Soviet victory and strategic prestige, but cannot sustainably fund that commitment without cost somewhere else. In geopolitics, there is a concept that strategists call the cost-benefit pivot point, the moment at which maintaining a position requires more than holding it is worth, even by the internal logic of the state that holds it. Kaliningrad has not reached that point yet, but the architecture being constructed around it is designed to bring that point closer. Every border crossing closed tightens the economic pressure. Every petroleum transit ban increases the logistical cost. Every fortification built south of the exclave narrows the military options. Every year that the Rail Baltica project advances makes the physical infrastructure for Russian access more permanent in its absence. Russia must hold Kaliningrad. Domestically, abandoning it would be politically catastrophic. Strategically, losing the Baltic foothold would fundamentally alter Russia's position in Northern Europe. Symbolically, it represents a legacy that Putin has built his entire political identity around defending. But holding Kaliningrad at rising cost, while fighting a depleting war on another front, while managing economic isolation from Western sanctions, while dealing with an electrical grid that depends on favorable Baltic weather, that is not a stable equilibrium. And NATO does not need to invade anything. It does not need to fire a shot. It needs only to continue doing exactly what it is doing: building walls, closing crossings, rerouting transit, changing rail gauges, expanding its military presence, and waiting. The strategy is patient. The strategy is legal. The strategy is already working. Here is what I want you to understand clearly before this analysis ends. What is happening to Kaliningrad is not a minor regional adjustment. It is not bureaucratic friction between neighbors. It is not even primarily about Kaliningrad itself. It is about what Kaliningrad represents and what its progressive isolation signals about where European security architecture is going. The countries doing this, Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic states, Germany, the NATO alliance, they are not reacting randomly. They are executing a strategic vision, A vision built on the judgment that Russia's military intervention in Ukraine removed the political obligation to tolerate Russian strategic presence at the heart of European defense geography. The message embedded in every closed border crossing, every halted petroleum train, every concrete dragon's tooth planted in the Polish soil is the same message. The tolerance that allowed Kaliningrad to function as a Russian military forward base inside NATO's territory is over, and Russia cannot respond with force. It cannot respond effectively with threats. It cannot even respond with economics, because the dependency runs only one way. Kaliningrad needs what NATO countries control. NATO countries do not need what Kaliningrad has, except to not be threatened by it. The strategic leverage has shifted. What was Moscow's strongest card in the Baltic, a nuclear-capable military exclave capable of threatening NATO capitals, is now also Moscow's heaviest strategic liability, a million-person population and a major military garrison that must be fed, fueled, powered, and supplied entirely through adversary-controlled territory at rising cost under conditions that will only tighten. Real power, sustained, strategic, durable power, is not measured by who you can threaten. It is measured by what you can sustain. And what Russia can sustain in Kaliningrad is declining, visibly, measurably, one supply line at a time. The vice does not need to close all at once. It only needs to keep tightening. And by every available measurement, that is exactly what it is doing. The most consequential strategic moves in modern geopolitics are rarely announced with explosions or declarations of war. They happen in the quiet language of customs regulations, transit agreements, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic closures that most of the world never reads about. What is being built around Kaliningrad right now belongs to that category. By the time the full consequences become visible to a general audience, the structural conditions that produce them will have been years in the making, and largely irreversible. This is why it matters. This is why it cannot be dismissed as a regional story. And this is why what happens next in Kaliningrad will tell us something fundamental about the shape of European power for the decades ahead. Pay attention to the quiet moves. They are where the real decisions are being made.